The courtroom was filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the shuffle of papers. Judge James Harrington sat at his bench, his eyes scanning the documents in front of him with practiced indifference. He had seen hundreds of cases like this before. A simple traffic violation, no need for much thought, just a fine to uphold the law with a steady hand. He had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the court. It was a system that worked. It had always worked. But something felt different today as his gaze lifted to the woman standing before him. Tanya Williams was her name. Her posture was straight, her eyes clear, but there was something about her presence that made the room feel smaller, like she carried her weight. No one could see she was calm, composed, but underneath the surface, her nerves fluttered. She had been through far worse than this moment, but the injustice of it felt like another burden in her already heavy life. Her hands rested loosely by her sides, but her fingers twitched ever so slightly as she looked up at the judge. Her explanation was simple. She had run the red light because she was late for a medical appointment. Her words were measured, not pleading, just a statement of fact. But Judge Harrington didn't seem to hear her. His gaze never left the papers in front of him, his face unreadable, his mind already made up. He had heard it all before, excuses and explanations from those who thought they could avoid the consequences with a simple sob story. But there was no room for leniency in his courtroom. The law was the law, and it was his duty to uphold it with no exceptions. Tanya's voice trailed off as the silence between them stretched for a moment too long. She felt the weight of his eyes, but said nothing more. She had learned to pick her battles, and this one wasn't worth fighting, not with someone like him. Judge Harrington's voice broke the silence, his words cold and clinical as he addressed her. "I'm fining you the maximum amount for running the light." He spoke as though he were handing down a routine sentence. It was just another case, another defendant, another fine, but to Tanya, it felt like a slap in the face. The injustice of it was sharp and personal, but she held her ground. She would not show him the anger that rose in her chest. She had learned that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. She didn't argue, she didn't fight. She simply nodded and accepted the fine, but the sting of the moment lingered in her chest like a wound that wouldn't heal. The judge barely glanced up as he handed her the paperwork. The sound of the pen on the paper punctuated the moment like a final judgment of who she was to him, just another black woman in the system, no different than any other defendant he'd had seen before in his years of service. Tanya took the paper and walked away, her steps measured and deliberate. But as she left the courtroom, she could feel the eyes of everyone on her. It wasn't just about the fine, it was about the assumptions made, the judgments passed on her. Before she even had a chance to speak, she knew this story too well. It was a story she had lived her whole life. It wasn't new, but it was always painful. As she stepped out into the cold air of the parking lot, Tanya took a deep breath. She had survived much worse than this, but it was still hard to shake the feeling that once again she had been reduced to nothing more than a label, a stereotype, something less than human, something to be judged and dismissed. Tanya Williams had never been one to talk much about her past. The layers of her life were buried deep within her mind, only revealed to those who had earned her trust, and even then the words came slowly like a river cutting through rock. Over time, the experiences that shaped her were etched into her soul, but she never wore them on her sleeve. They were a part of her, a quiet strength that guided her through the hardest days. It was easier to keep the pain locked away, out of sight, out of reach. But today, as she walked away from the courtroom, the weight of it all seemed to press down on her even more than usual. She had never been afraid of battle, but the wars she fought outside of the military were often harder than any she had fought in uniform. Tanya's journey into the army had started with a deep sense of purpose. She had always wanted to serve her country. She wanted to be part of something bigger than herself, to make a difference. But she hadn't known how much that choice would cost her. When she first enlisted, it had felt like a noble decision, a way to prove herself to her family and to her community. But the reality of military life was far more brutal than she had anticipated. She had seen things that no person should ever have to see, and had done things that haunted her when the nights grew quiet and the memories resurfaced like ghosts calling her name. The deployments had taken her to places she never could have imagined. In her hometown in Mississippi, the world had felt small, but in the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan, everything was different. She had faced death more times than she could count, but it wasn't the explosions or the gunfire that stayed with her. It was the faces of the people she met, the soldiers, the civilians, the children who looked at her with eyes full of fear and hope. All at once she had carried their stories with her when she returned home, but in the end, it was the quiet trauma that followed her that would define her life. Back in the States, Tanya struggled to find her place. She tried to fit into a world that didn't understand the things she had been through and the weight of being a black woman in a country that often seemed to forget her people's sacrifices made it even harder. She had done her best to move forward, building a life for herself and her children in a world that didn't always make room for her struggles, but it was never easy. After her military service, Tanya had found herself isolated, unsure of where to turn. She had become an advocate for fellow veterans, but often found herself fighting just as hard for respect in a community that still viewed her through a narrow lens. Her experiences as a black woman in the Army had taught her that even the most sacred institutions weren't immune to racial bias, but it had also taught her resilience. She had learned to rise above the obstacles and stand firm in her identity. As she sat in her car after leaving the courtroom, Tanya allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The fine was just another small wound in the long list of battles she had fought, but it stung in a way that none of the others had before. It wasn't the money that bothered her, it was the fact that for a moment she had been seen only as a defendant, a stereotype, and not as a woman who had given everything for her country, everything for the people around her. The pain of that moment settled deep in her chest. But she knew she would get through it like she always did. She would keep fighting, even when it felt like no one was watching, even when it felt like the world had forgotten her. Judge James Harrington had spent years in the courtroom, a steady hand, a reliable figure in his small town. His reputation was built on order and efficiency, and he prided himself on being fair, even if fairness sometimes meant being harsh. In the quiet of his chambers after a long day, he usually felt a sense of finality, knowing he had made his decisions with the law as his guide. But today was different. The image of Tanya Williams, calm yet resolute, haunted him. The fine he had imposed on her sat heavily on his conscience. He had seen hundreds of defendants pass through his courtroom, but something about Tanya's case gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a snap judgment, that he had dismissed her too quickly. After all, how could a simple traffic violation warrant such a reaction? Was it the rush to issue a fine that had clouded his thinking, or had he let his own biases cloud his judgment? At home that evening, Judge Harrington couldn't escape the nagging feeling that had been tugging at him all day. His wife, Carol, was already in bed, the house quiet, but his thoughts wouldn't settle. He tried to focus on the mundane, glancing through the evening newspaper, but his mind kept returning to Tanya. Her face, her words, her calmness in the face of a harsh ruling. They all seemed to stick with him in a way he hadn't expected. Tanya wasn't just another defendant. He knew that now. But what was it about her that made this case different? Why couldn't he move on? Carol stirred in bed, sensing his unease. "James, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft, laced with concern. He hesitated for a moment, torn between wanting to let the feeling go and knowing he couldn't. "I don't know, Carol," he admitted, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "I just keep thinking about that woman, Tanya Williams. Something doesn't sit right with me." His wife propped herself up, her voice warm but questioning. "What do you mean? She was just another case, wasn't she?" Judge Harrington sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's just it. It shouldn't feel personal, but it does. I issued a fine without really considering who she was or why she might have been in that situation. I didn't even listen to her story properly." He paused, trying to make sense of his thoughts. "I'm not sure I did her justice, Carol. There's something about her that, I don't know, it's bothering me." Carol remained quiet for a moment, her thoughts clearly processing his words. "James, maybe you should look into her. Find out who she really is. You might be surprised." The suggestion hit him like a jolt of electricity. He had assumed so much about Tanya based on the surface, an error in judgment he had become too accustomed to making, too quick to dismiss people and their circumstances. He thought he knew the truth because he had a gavel in his hand, but that didn't mean he truly understood the stories behind the faces that came before him. The next morning, before his regular docket began, Judge Harrington couldn't resist any longer. He pulled up Tanya's name on his computer, hoping to uncover something, anything that might shed light on her life. His search brought up the most unexpected results. Tanya Williams, U.S. Army veteran, decorated for bravery, service in combat zones. The pages listed her military accolades, her awards for valor, and her tireless advocacy for fellow veterans, particularly those facing post-traumatic stress disorder and the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life. The revelation struck him like a thunderclap. He had found a woman who had served her country with distinction. Tanya Williams was not just another traffic violator. She was a decorated veteran, a hero in her own right, whose story had been overlooked simply because he hadn't bothered to look beyond the surface. His stomach churned with regret. How could he have been so blind? Judge Harrington sat frozen at his desk, staring at the screen in disbelief. The file before him painted a portrait of a woman who had faced unimaginable challenges and yet had never once allowed them to define her. Tanya Williams wasn't just a defendant in his courtroom, she was a decorated veteran, a survivor, a fighter. As he read about her service in Iraq and Afghanistan, her commendations for bravery, and her advocacy for veterans who struggled with PTSD, a deep sense of shame began to settle in his chest. The more he read, the more the image of Tanya in his courtroom shifted. She wasn't just some traffic offender. She was a woman who had fought for her country, risked her life for strangers, and now, years later, was struggling to find a place for herself in a society that too often overlooked or dismissed her. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the depth of his misjudgment. He had been so quick to issue a fine, to assert his authority without considering who she was or what she had been through. And worse, he had done it with a level of indifference that now felt inexcusable. His fingers hovered over the keys, torn between wanting to find a way to undo the damage and the fear of confronting the reality of his actions. Tanya had been there in his courtrooms, standing before him with nothing but her truth, and he had responded with harshness. He had been blind to the weight she carried, to the sacrifices she had made, and to the pain she was no doubt feeling as a result of being seen as just another person in the system. Judge Harrington knew he had to do something, but what? Could he just go to her and apologize? Was that even enough to right the wrong? He couldn't erase the past, but he could try to make amends, to acknowledge the depth of his error. The thought of trying to reach out to Tanya was daunting. How could he explain the rush of his decision, the fact that he had failed to see her humanity? But he also knew that if he didn't take some kind of action, the guilt would eat away at him for far longer than he could bear. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he never thought he'd call. It rang 3 times before a soft voice answered. "Hello, this is Tanya Williams," she said, a slight hesitation in her tone, perhaps wondering who would be calling at this hour. "This is Judge Harrington," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. I need to speak with you. It's about the case from yesterday. I realize I made a terrible mistake, and I need to apologize." There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, Judge Harrington feared she might hang up on him. But then Tanya spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "What kind of mistake?" He took a deep breath, knowing he had to lay everything bare. "I find you without truly understanding who you are. I dismissed you as just another person before me without considering the service you've given to this country. You've been a hero, Tanya, and I treated you like any other defendant. And for that, I am deeply sorry." The words hung in the air between them, and Judge Harrington waited for a response, unsure what to expect. Tanya's voice returned, slower this time, as if she were processing his apology. "You didn't know who I was," she said softly. "But you do now." "Yes," he agreed, feeling the weight of those words. "And I should have known before. I shouldn't have assumed. I shouldn't have rushed to judgment." There was another pause, but this time it wasn't heavy with silence. It was thoughtful, measured. "I appreciate the apology, Judge," she finally said. "But I need more than words. I need people to see what we've gone through, what we continue to go through after serving. I don't want sympathy, but I want respect. That's the least we deserve." Judge Harrington nodded even though she couldn't see him. "I understand, and I'll do everything I can to make it right. I can't undo what's been done, but I will stand by you from here on out. I'll make sure people know what you've done for this country." Tanya paused for a moment before replying. "We'll see, Judge, but thank you for saying that." As the call ended, Judge Harrington sat back in his chair, the weight of his apology still lingering but somehow lighter than it had been before. He knew this wasn't the end. He knew that if he truly wanted to make things right, he would have to show up, not just in words but in actions. Tanya had spoken of respect, and it was time for him to learn what that meant, truly learn it, and not just apply it in the courtroom, but in every aspect of his life. And Tanya? She had been patient, but her resolve was unshakable. The apology was a start, but she needed more than that. It was clear now, more than ever, that the road to true justice was long, but Tanya Williams wasn't afraid to walk it, even if she had to walk it alone. In the days following their phone call, Judge Harrington found himself consumed by the weight of his own actions. Tanya Williams had been more than patient with him, but he knew that patience alone wouldn't change the history of what had transpired. The truth was simple: he had failed her. And yet, the moment she had shown him a glimpse of her humanity, his entire perspective shifted. It wasn't just about a traffic fine or a case on a docket. It was about recognizing the depth of someone's story, the courage it took to survive, and the value that every person held, regardless of their background. As the days passed, the judge began to take small, yet significant steps toward rectifying his mistake. He had already made an apology, but that alone wouldn't erase the harm done. He needed to go beyond his own courtroom, to show Tanya that his words had meaning. He reached out to colleagues in the local veterans community and made arrangements to meet with Tanya in person. It was an awkward first step, but he knew it was necessary if he truly wanted to be accountable for the error he had made. One afternoon, several days after their phone call, Judge Harrington sat in his car outside a local veterans support center. The place was quiet, unassuming, tucked between a couple of storefronts in a modest part of town. He had never really known much about the center beyond the fact that it existed. In the past, he had simply driven by without giving it much thought. Today, he was going to learn what he had missed for so many years. Tanya had agreed to meet him here. He entered the building and was greeted by a woman behind the counter who, after a brief exchange, led him to a room where Tanya was waiting. She stood up when he walked in, her posture commanding respect, though her expression was unreadable. She was a veteran, and her presence alone spoke volumes. There was no question about her strength. It was written in the lines of her face, the way she carried herself. "Judge Harrington," she said, her tone still measured but not unkind. "It's good to see you." "Thank you for meeting with me," he replied, unsure of what to expect. He knew that saying the wrong thing would undo all the progress they had made so far. He had to be careful, measured. His words had to be as deliberate as his actions. They sat across from each other, the silence between them filled with the hum of the center's activity. Tanya had already told him a little about her life, her work with other veterans, the struggles she had faced reintegrating into civilian life after her service. But hearing it in person felt different. This wasn't just a case or a number. This was Tanya Williams, a woman who had faced battles far greater than any judge in a courtroom could imagine. Her voice, steady and strong, conveyed the weight of her experience. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said on the phone," Tanya began, breaking the silence. "About respect. You can't just give respect. You have to earn it. I've been through things that most people can't even begin to understand. And every time I'm dismissed, whether it's by a judge or by someone who doesn't see me as anything more than a statistic, it takes a little more of that respect away." Judge Harrington nodded, his gaze steady. "I know. And I've failed you, Tanya. I've failed you by not seeing who you are and what you've been through. I've spent too much time looking at cases as just cases. I've treated people like numbers on a page." Tanya didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the words sit in the air between them, like a heavy truth that had to be acknowledged before any real change could happen. "It's easy to forget who people really are," she said softly. "When you're looking at so many faces every day, you don't have time to see the person behind the paperwork. But that's the problem, isn't it? You can't just deal with the surface and expect real justice. You can't fix anything unless you're willing to dig deeper. Her words hit him harder than he had expected. He had lived his life making judgments based on what was in front of him. Papers, records, facts. But Tanya was right. None of that told the full story. None of it gave him the real picture of who these people were, what they had survived, what they had contributed. "I'm here, Tanya," Judge Harrington said, his voice firm but compassionate, "because I want to understand. I want to do better. I want to use my position to help create real change for people like you, people who deserve respect and recognition. You shouldn't be a footnote in the system, and I shouldn't be part of a system that makes you feel that way." Tanya studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. She could tell that he wasn't just speaking from obligation. There was something genuine in his words. After a long pause, she nodded. "I believe you," she said quietly. "But it's going to take more than just a conversation. It's going to take action." Judge Harrington nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. She was right. Actions would speak louder than anything he could say. But this was a start, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the path to making something right. Over the following weeks, Judge Harrington did everything he could to keep his word to Tanya. He began attending veterans meetings, sitting in on support groups, and learning more about the challenges faced by those who had served their country. The more he learned, the more he realized how much he had taken for granted. Veterans like Tanya, who had sacrificed so much for their country, were often forgotten by the very institutions that were supposed to support them. It wasn't just about the systems in place. It was about the people who had been failed by those systems, people who had been invisible for too long. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Slowly, he began to earn the trust of those around him. The veterans he spoke to were wary at first, unsure if his interest was genuine. But Judge Harrington's consistent presence, his willingness to listen, and his determination to make things right began to win them over. He didn't try to fix everything overnight, and he didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he made it clear that he was there to learn and to stand alongside them. For Tanya, the judge's newfound commitment was both encouraging and a little overwhelming. She had seen too many people come and go, making promises that never materialized, but there was something different about Judge Harrington. It wasn't just his words, it was the quiet persistence in his actions. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't offer shallow apologies or quick solutions. Instead, he was working toward real change, small step by small step. For the first time in a long while, Tanya felt seen, not just as a veteran, but as a person. One afternoon, several weeks into their new dynamic, Tanya invited Judge Harrington to a special event at the Veterans Center, a ceremony honoring the service of local veterans. It wasn't just about awards or accolades. It was about creating a space where those who had served could come together and share their experiences. Tanya had been part of the organizing committee, and she wanted Judge Harrington to see firsthand what veterans truly needed. She wanted him to witness their resilience, their stories, and the community they had built in the face of adversity. Judge Harrington arrived at the ceremony, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. He had been to many events over the years, but none like this. This wasn't a room full of paperwork or formalities. This was a room full of people whose stories had been written in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. As he entered, he was greeted with cautious nods and wary glances. He wasn't the judge anymore. He was just another guest, trying to fit into a world he had never fully understood. Tanya was there, of course, standing tall as always, her presence commanding attention. She noticed him immediately and gave him a small but welcoming smile. As the ceremony began, Judge Harrington stood quietly at the back of the room, his gaze scanning the faces of the veterans. He saw the weariness in their eyes, the silent strength they carried, and the quiet pride that came with knowing they had done their duty, even when the world around them didn't always acknowledge it. As the event progressed, Tanya took the stage to speak, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She spoke not only of her own journey, but of the collective struggles of those who had served. She talked about the battles they had fought on foreign soil and the ones they continued to fight back home, against stigmas, against neglect, and against the isolation that often came with being a veteran. Judge Harrington watched her with a new understanding, his eyes focused not just on her words, but on the power behind them. He could see the weight she carried, and he could see that this wasn't just a speech. It was a call to action. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was demanding respect. Respect for her fellow veterans, respect for their sacrifices, and respect for the lives they had built despite the challenges they faced. When Tanya finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Judge Harrington joined in, his hands clapping louder than he expected, but the applause felt different now. It wasn't just for Tanya's words, it was for everything she represented. It was for every veteran who had ever been overlooked or dismissed, for every person who had been made to feel less than human by a system that should have protected them. After the ceremony, Tanya approached him, her face softened by a smile. "Thank you for coming, Judge," she said. "I know it wasn't easy, but you showed up, and that's what matters." He looked at her, his expression sincere. "No, thank you, Tanya. You've taught me more than I could have ever learned on my own. I have a lot of work to do, but I'm here. I'm with you." Tanya nodded, and for the first time, Judge Harrington felt like he was no longer just an outsider. He wasn't just a judge handing down sentences. He was part of something much bigger. And as he stood there, amidst the veterans and their stories, he knew that this was only the beginning of the change that needed to happen. For the first time in his career, he truly understood what it meant to serve. Months turned into years, and Judge Harrington's commitment to the veterans' cause continued to grow stronger. He had once been a man focused solely on the black and white rules of the courtroom, but now he saw the complexities of the world through a different lens. He had learned to listen, to understand, and most importantly, to act. His courtroom was no longer just a place for punishment. It had become a space where he fought for fairness, where he worked to ensure that those who had served their country were treated with the dignity they deserved. Tanya Williams had become an integral part of his life, and together, they had forged a path that many said was impossible. The veterans' docket that Judge Harrington had pushed for was finally in place, a special court dedicated to veterans who had fallen into legal trouble but had the potential for rehabilitation. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The docket allowed veterans to receive tailored treatment, counseling, and support, all while still being held accountable for their actions. For many, it was the second chance they had needed to rebuild their lives. Tanya had become a key figure in the program, working closely with veterans in the court system and using her own experiences to guide them. She had earned the trust of those who had been hardened by their experiences and had found a way to connect with them in ways that others couldn't. It was her voice that carried the weight of their struggles, and it was her voice that helped Judge Harrington make decisions that truly impacted their lives. One day, Tanya stood outside the courthouse, looking out at the city she had fought so hard to protect. It was a bright morning, but there was an air of quiet reflection as she thought about how far they had come. She had never imagined, back when she had first faced Judge Harrington in court, that they would be standing here together, changing lives and fighting for the rights of veterans. Her life had been a journey of uncertainty, of overcoming obstacles and facing challenges that sometimes seemed insurmountable. But now, as she looked at the work they had accomplished, she could see the results of their efforts. Lives had been saved, futures had been changed. Judge Harrington walked up beside her, his presence steady and sure. He had changed as much as she had, perhaps more. The once rigid man who had once made decisions based on protocol now saw the faces of those he ruled over. He knew their stories. He knew their struggles. And more importantly, he was determined to help them. "It's been a long road, Tanya," Judge Harrington said, breaking the silence. "But I think we're getting somewhere." Tanya nodded, her gaze still fixed on the street in front of them. "Yeah, we are, but there's always more to do. The work never stops. There are always more veterans who need help, more lives to change." "I know," he replied, "but I never would have started this journey without you. You've taught me what real justice looks like, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Tanya turned to face him, a small but genuine smile on her face. "We've both learned a lot, Judge. We're just getting started." As they walked back into the courthouse, the sense of purpose that filled the air was palpable. The work they were doing mattered. It was making a difference, one case at a time. And even though they both knew the road ahead would continue to be challenging, they were ready for it. There was no turning back now. Judge Harrington had once judged people based on their actions alone, but now he judged them by their character, their resilience, and the stories they carried with them. The fine he had imposed on Tanya all those months ago felt like a lifetime ago, a stark reminder of how far he had come and how much he had learned. Tanya's forgiveness had been the first step, and it had sparked something in him that he could never undo. He knew he would spend the rest of his life working to make sure that the people he served in his courtroom, veterans in particular, would never feel forgotten again. Together, Tanya and Judge Harrington had started a movement, a ripple of change that would continue to spread throughout the community. They had proven that true justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about seeing people for who they were, understanding their struggles, and fighting for their future. And in that, they had found a shared purpose that would continue to guide them for the rest of their lives. As they moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that the work they had started was far from over. But they also carried the hope that through their actions, they could make a world where no one was ever overlooked again, a world where respect was given freely, not earned, and where every person, especially those who had served their country, could find the support they deserved. Months turned into years, and Judge Harrington's commitment to the veterans' cause continued to grow stronger. He had once been a man focused solely on the black and white rules of the courtroom, but now he saw the complexities of the world through a different lens. He had learned to listen, to understand, and most importantly, to act. His courtroom was no longer just a place for punishment. It had become a space where he fought for fairness, where he worked to ensure that those who had served their country were treated with the dignity they deserved. Tanya Williams had become an integral part of his life, and together they had forged a path that many said was impossible. The veterans' docket that Judge Harrington had pushed for was finally in place, a special court dedicated to veterans who had fallen into legal trouble but had the potential for rehabilitation. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The docket allowed veterans to receive tailored treatment, counseling, and support, all while still being held accountable for their actions. For many, it was the second chance they had needed to rebuild their lives. Tanya had become a key figure in the program, working closely with veterans in the court system and using her own experiences to guide them. She had earned the trust of those who had been hardened by their experiences and had found a way to connect with them in ways that others couldn't. It was her voice that carried the weight of their struggles, and it was her voice that helped Judge Harrington make decisions that truly impacted their lives. One day, Tanya stood outside the courthouse, looking out at the city she had fought so hard to protect. It was a bright morning, but there was an air of quiet reflection as she thought about how far they had come. She had never imagined, back when she had first faced Judge Harrington in court, that they would be standing here together, changing lives and fighting for the rights of veterans. Her life had been a journey of uncertainty, of overcoming obstacles and facing challenges that sometimes seemed insurmountable. But now, as she looked at the work they had accomplished, she could see the results of their efforts. Lives had been saved. Futures had been changed. Judge Harrington walked up beside her, his presence steady and sure. He had changed as much as she had, perhaps more. The once rigid man who had once made decisions based on protocol now saw the faces of those he ruled over. He knew their stories. He knew their struggles. And more importantly, he was determined to help them. "It's been a long road, Tanya," Judge Harrington said, breaking the silence. "But I think we're getting somewhere." Tanya nodded, her gaze still fixed on the street in front of them. "Yeah, we are, but there's always more to do. The work never stops. There are always more veterans who need help, more lives to change." "I know," he replied, "but I never would have started this journey without you. You've taught me what real justice looks like, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Tanya turned to face him, a small but genuine smile on her face. "We've both learned a lot, Judge. We're just getting started." As they walked back into the courthouse, the sense of purpose that filled the air was palpable. The work they were doing mattered. It was making a difference, one case at a time. And even though they both knew the road ahead would continue to be challenging, they were ready for it. There was no turning back now. Judge Harrington had once judged people based on their actions alone, but now he judged them by their character, their resilience, and the stories they carried with them. The fine he had imposed on Tanya all those months ago felt like a lifetime ago, a stark reminder of how far he had come and how much he had learned. Tanya's forgiveness had been the first step, and it had sparked something in him that he could never undo. He knew he would spend the rest of his life working to make sure that the people he served in his courtroom, veterans in particular, would never feel forgotten again. Together, Tanya and Judge Harrington had started a movement, a ripple of change that would continue to spread throughout the community. They had proven that true justice wasn't just about following the law, it was about seeing people for who they were, understanding their struggles, and fighting for their future. And in that, they had found a shared purpose that would continue to guide them for the rest of their lives. As they moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that the work they had started was far from over. But they also carried the hope that through their actions, they could make a world where no one was ever overlooked again. A world where respect was given freely, not earned, and where every person, especially those who had served their country, could find the support they deserved.